Hey, everybody. I'm Aaron Simmons, joined with my co host, Brian Bibb. And this is God Hates Us All Radio. So excited that you're joining us. I think this is episode 5, if I'm not mistaken. So beginning to get a little bit of an archive, though I'm not sure there are any deep cuts yet, Brian. And today we are super excited because we are joined with our first guest on the podcast, Nick Smith, who is a philosopher and professor up at the University of New Hampshire and works in ethics and related issues. I've been a fan of his philosophical work for a long time. And recently, though, my buddy Ben McCraw and I were able to convince him to join us in helping write this book we're doing called The Heaviest Ideas in the Universe, A Philosophy of Heavy Metal. And Nick's essay is just so badass that we thought we would invite him to join us today and talk about those ideas and other issues related to the idea of mosh pits. So, Nick, thanks so much for joining us, man.
Thank you for having me. Super fun to work on these issues.
Well, I appreciate you being here. So, yesterday, Nick, I haven't told you this, I don't think, Brian, either. I'm reading, copy editing these essays for this volume, and one came in from Dave Hunt, who happens to also be the vocalist for the extreme metal band called Anal Nakrath. And so I'm reading Dave's essay while listening to Anal Nakrath music. And it was the most surreal and maybe coolest experience of my philosophical career. So you're listening to We Will Effing Kill You and, Endarkenment and Forward into Defeat and stuff. And then I'm reading this essay about meta ethics and rational motivation theory. It was hilarious. And so I'm super, super stoked for the book. Glad you could be part of it, man.
I think it's super cool that, when you realize how many philosophers are interested in this stuff, it's not an accident, right? I mean, I think as I say in the paper, extreme music, it attracts people on the edges in all sorts of areas, right? And philosophers are often existing at the edges, and this is a really ripe sort of area, and it's fascinating how many of my friends who've become professional philosophers are also metalheads.
Yeah.
And it's not accidental. And trying to figure out, okay, what's the Venn diagram of what's going on there?
What pulls them together? I was just this week over in Nashville hanging out with Rob Talise and Scott Aiken and the other contributors to the volume. And Talise has now, there was a office next to his office that was empty for a day and a half. And so he claimed it as his guitar storage. And so now when you walk up to his office, there's one actual official nameplate, Robert Talise, Alton Jones Chair of Philosophy. And then there's one that he's written on an index card that just says Guitar Shop. And that's where he sits and plays punk music and records a YouTube channel and then goes over and writes, books on democracy. So I think there is something weird about that Venn diagram, but it's super cool to have the three of us together today. And so the topic of your essay is really what we wanted to dig into, because I don't think, Brian, we've talked about the idea of moshing really yet on the podcast. And Nick, you suggest that, in sort of most simple terms, moshing on the surface has an unbelievably negative, dangerous, and seemingly immoral set of issues associated with it. On the other hand, it might offer a kind of vision of ethical community in, really straightforward and yet problematic ways. And then you end by suggesting there's some ways that we can rehabilitate how we approach moshing in order to get it to lean more into this ethical community rather than this kind of, violent demons that infect its nature. And so to unpack a little bit about that, can you tell us just a little bit about how you got into metal and got into moshing and why this is even a question of interest for you relative to your philosophical pursuits?
I mean, I think like a lot of us, I'm 53 years old. So when I was a young teenager, I played sports, but I hated bros before we called them bros. I was like an athlete who wasn't, was looking for alternative ways and, generally having various kinds of existential crises like a lot of us. And we sort of, drift towards, alternative culture. Right. And this is way before I'd ever read Adorno or anything like this. Um, and growing up in the late 80s was really a great time to have these sorts of needs. So growing up in suburban, ruralish Western New York, sort of a few clicks towards the Midwest, you got a lot of exposure to stuff, and it became a pre-theoretical form of interest in alternative culture, where I was actually like in the middle of an alternative culture, and I wasn't like an early adopter or very far on the edges of it, but it was definitely like something that I thought was cool.
Yeah.
And way cooler than sports, and way more interesting. And the people who are interested in that tend just to be more my vibe and had the intellectual curiosity. And it was super fun going to shows. But at the same time, I realized a lot of it was messed up.
Mm-hmm.
And, the messed upness was part of the attraction to whatever a 15, 16-year-old kid, where it's like, whoa, this is intense and interesting and cool, but also like, that's a swastika over there.
Right.
And
Right.
that's kind of interesting. And, different time in the world also. But it had this, the title of the paper is Conflicted. And it had this conflicted appeal to me from the very outset, that it has a certain kind of energy and life affirmingness, but at the same time, it's sort of on the razor's edge of some of the nastiest stuff. So, right. And, then I became a philosopher, and as an undergraduate, I became very interested in critical theory. And I realized, wow, there's a lot going on here that I hadn't quite made explicit. So, being able to work on a paper like this was very gratifying. I had done earlier work on extreme music, extreme noise music, and Japanese metal and stuff. Some of my first publications, some of the biggest crowds I've ever spoken to were on Japanese noise metal.
Wow.
In sort of 20 or so years ago. There used to be a really big, a lot of theoretical interest in Japanese noise music, and sort of the artist slash DJ slash philosopher slash how extreme can we get culture. And some of those people have become kind of famous, and not for good reasons. So it's an interesting crowd.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Bryan, you of course, we talk a lot on the podcast about that. You're kind of the old head relative to heavy metal, and I kind of pick up at like 1995 or 2000 to present. So was this sort of alternative culture and moshing, like, was that actually part of your also early experiences of metal yourself, or did you experience it more in that crowd headbanging way that doesn't have that energy of this chaos erupting in the center that then is spilling in some ways?
Well, it's interesting. I think that there was a shift in the kind of cultural divides that Nick is describing in the 80s versus the 90s. I mean, if you've seen like the documentary about Woodstock 99, like what sort of happens, with the bro culture kind of invading and taking over. And that's where you start to see some of the worst excesses of the kind of stuff that he's describing. But I mean, I was drawn to metal in the 80s as a kind of lifeline. I lived in a small town. So this is a thing that took place in my headphones, right? There weren't any punk shows in my town, or the idea of like going to a metal show, like one of these kind of real, extreme metal shows was not on the radar really. I mean, we went to a handful of shows here in Greenville, but they were more like Dio. You know what I mean? Like
dragon slaying and magic
but
mountains and things. Yeah.
I didn't go to any clubs really until much later, and I've actually never been in a mosh, and it was interesting to read about it. I mean, I've been in shows where it was sort of happening at a smaller level at the front, but I've never gotten involved, and I've never been part of a show where they had like one of the huge ones.
Right. It's interesting. So, Nick, you talked about this idea of the repulsive is also what attracts, right? And it's strange. I took my son I guess this has been maybe 3 months ago, maybe 6 months ago. I don't know. Anyway, in the last little bit, I took my son to his first, what I considered, kind of metal show. He was able to really experience stuff. One of my actual favorite bands, this kind of hardcore metal inspired group, Norma Jean. And there was a pit. My ability to participate was limited by the fact that I had just had cataract surgery. So, which I think is probably the, how do you say you're too old to be in the pit without saying it? that might be the way. So I just had cataract surgery. I couldn't get punched. It would mess up this very expensive eye surgery. So I was like, look, man, I can't go in anything tonight. You should get involved. No, I don't know. I don't know about this. Some of my students were there. And so I told my students, like, look, guys, if you don't mind, find a way to get my son involved, right? Mm-hmm. And so the show starts, pit forms. One of my students, to my great, like, tears of joy pleasure, grabs my son and throws him into the pit. My son lasts maybe 3 seconds before going down. And then immediately the tears of joy become panic, like, is he okay? And he hops up, throws both hands up with horns, yells, and then he was in the pit the rest of the night. And now he's got a like ganglion cyst that has formed on his wrist because of when he went down, it like hurt his wrist, and he wears it like a badge of honor and may have mentioned recently, Dad, wouldn't it be cool if I get like a Norma Jean tattoo on my cyst? So in the same way, like the thing that was dangerous and a little bit brutal also somehow had this attractive, transformative, community building dimension. How is it that you make sense of the thing that should cause us to stay away is somehow what also draws us closer?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, right? With many layers, especially when we're talking about teenagers. So I have similar experience. I have 3 boys. They're all teenagers right now. And, I also coach sports. I coach a lot of soccer. My kids all play sports. And that's also a really kind of crappy community that can be really affirming and wonderful and can be horrible. Right. And when I coach, right, one of the reasons I coach is to try to set a model for how to be like a emotionally intelligent, thoughtful, like, physically capable, right. Pushing it, like all the good things about sports without the bad things about sports. So I put myself in the mix there as well with teenage boys. And just last night we had an important game, and it's like, it's usually gross, the kind of behavior you see. And I'm like, why am I in the middle of this stuff? I'm doing this because I want a responsible adult, like steering the ship toward the good and away from the bad. Moshing is kind of a similar sort of thing, right? Like whatever, if you play football or any kind of contact sport, like, yeah, you can certainly have head injuries. You can, lots of bad things can happen. You can have a lot of emotional injuries, right? Like a lot of athletes, like, is it net beneficial for a lot of athletes over the course of their life? It's hard to say. It's really hard to say, right? The sort of emotional, intellectual, physical things that are caused by contact sports, right? But my kids are doing it, and I want them to do it because I want them to have that experience. Especially in this generation, where just getting them out in the world, away from screens, having experiences, music, shows, pits are a sort of really, really concentrated version of that. Okay, so it's the danger, right? And whether it's a danger of playing football, skateboarding, being in a pit, learning how to navigate those things sensibly, right? Like a lot of the thrill and joy and meaning of life comes at the edge of failure, right? Where you're pushing yourself just to your ability and like having the bodily control and emotional control to succeed in difficult environments, right? So even like when your son goes down, it's like that could have been like tears and I'm done and I'm embarrassed and I'm gonna remember that for a long time, and I'm gonna feel like I let my dad down and his like or it can be like, I can do this. This is actually like rich and interesting. And now it's like part of the fabric of my identity that I can like, I can hang in this environment, and it's fun and it's life affirming. And it's also a little dodgy. You know, and the dodgy, without that risk, it's just like, you know, in sports, like you want to lose at least half the time. You don't want to win every game because it's like, that's stupid. You want to be at the edge of, you know, playing kids that are bigger than you and being in risky situations. That's part of what makes the, you know, the achievement meaningful. With with metal, there's many more layers of extreme, right? Sort of much more sophisticated cultural layers of extreme that, you know, that people are navigating and trying to navigate successfully, where the, you know, the dangers like are, you know, and somewhat, you don't want to overstate them, but, you know, people do die, and there are head injuries, and there are Nazis, and like, you know, I mean, how many times am I in proximity to fascists? Like, you know, real, like, not just like kind of fascists, but like people actually, you know, open about it. It's like, oh, that's a thing. And how do we navigate this world? You know, it's like a little bit of moth drawn to the flame. You know, looking for richness, looking for experience, looking for intensity, right? Looking for to whatever, suck the marrow out of life, like, you know, seeking out places where that's going to happen that are like reasonable, right? You know, it's like whatever. Extreme sports are a similar kind of thing, but you know, moshing is its own thing.
One thing I liked about I liked your essay a lot, and one of the points you made relates to this point, and I don't think you mentioned, maybe I missed it, but I don't think you made the explicit comparison to sports in the essay, but it's like perfect comparison. How many places in society are we allowed to exercise aggression? Like, how can we, where are we actually permitted to work out some of that, right? And in an online culture where everything is internal and it just gets the pressure, and it's just more and more and more, the online culture is way more violent than the mosh pit, right? And you just it just gets right. So the idea of having a place where you can do that, and then also human contact, physical contact, right? I mean, and it's a lot of it is, you know, hitting each other, but it's the same kind of thing you see with, you know, football, you know, in the line, where guys are knocking the crap out of each other, and then they're picking each other up and like patting them on the back or the butt, you know, and it's like, yeah, this is like a thing we did together. And that kind of physical, just we are going together to exercise our aggression in a way that is communal and is bonding and that is cathartic and is a more healthy, positive working out of these dark tendencies in our soul. I mean, I think that's the strongest argument for it that I've encountered. I thought that was very interesting.
And building skills, right? Like building skills to have those emotionally heightened and physical contact confrontations where, you know, like, you know, sometimes I worry people who don't play sports or do things like this, they haven't built the skills of emotional regulation in intense environments. And then you put them in intense, like if you ever seen, I mean, it's not the best example, but kids who don't play sports and then you throw them into a sporting environment and they get like weirdly hyper competitive and inappropriately like they don't know how to process the situation, right? And you know, they get like weird, like, you know, and it's like, okay, like they haven't built the skills yet, right? And that's one thing we do with sports is building the skills of emotional regulation in intense environments when you have a goal and maybe someone beats you to it, right? And it's like, oh, okay, I've done this 1,000 times. So when it happens to me in like, you know, any other environment in life, like I've built some grit and resiliency, and I'm comfortable with tension, conflicts, challenges, I'm used to being in environments where other people are dysregulated and I'm able to de-escalate. You know, I think those are meaningful skills. But in addition to like the instrumental value, it's also like super fun, right? Like, so part of what I want my kids to have is as I mentioned in the essay, it's like, I'm embarrassed to say that some of like the most fun moments of my life, and I've had like an awesome life, like I have so much to be thankful for, but some of my favorite moments are like those moments at shows Like it's super life affirming and just joyous. And like, I want my kids to have that joy. Like, yeah, I want them to learn the skills, but like, I want them to have that joy. And it's cool because it's whatever, like winning a state championship, like there's a certain kind of joy in that, but it's like, oh, you have to beat someone else and like, blah, 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 who cares? But like, there's a certain kind of inherent meaning in being a part of that sort of aesthetic environment and communal environment that I would like to be part of my kids' lives, because I think it's really central to the sort of what I am and what I find kind of like important, meaningful, like good, like how to spend an evening. Like that's fun. That's interesting. That's good stuff.
It's weird. So my son is 16, almost 16, and is part of a fine arts high school. So he's a very talented percussionist and does jazz studies and stuff. And he's also on the tennis team for his high school. So he's an athlete, but then, this musician. And it's fascinating because far and away, the more pressure cooker, can you handle what is being expected of you, happens in the musical space for him. He's surrounded by excellence. The level is exceptionally high. And he'll come home sometimes and I'm like, well, hey, do you need to get that practicing done? And he's like, what's the point? Like, whoever, his friend Grant or something, he's like, he's so much better at this than me, I can't catch up. And I'm like, oh, well, this is perhaps one of the most important like adulting lessons to be learned. There's always someone better than you. How is it then that you navigate that? Does that mean that we abandon a commitment to excellence, or does it mean that excellence is not ultimately about being better than them? So I've found that music, it doesn't even have to be the competitive, like against someone else, but just the idea that excellence is something that always, even from friends, right? Aristotle would talk about the friends of virtue that encourage us always to be better than our complacency would allow us to be. I think music has been even more important for my son than watching him in sports, though that does something relative to the physicality. So when he's playing tennis, when he was 5, 6, 7 years old, he would be in these tennis matches, of course, which are all exhibition and everybody's fun and everybody gets juice boxes at the end. And yet he would get furious because somebody had served too hard and he couldn't return it, or he ran for the ball, but it got locked in the net or whatever. And he would lose his temper. And so we started practicing with him, and he hated it, but I would have this chant, lose your temper, lose the point. And then I might start dancing around like a crab and doing things to like intentionally sort of pick just a little bit at that sore, right? And it's so funny because now at almost 16, he'll play and he's able to recognize that he's starting to get back in that cycle. And then he'll hear me, lose your temper, lose the point. And then it like actually causes him to be able, like you say, to regulate his emotional response, engage in cooperative behavior that will hopefully allow him to be the kind of mature social being that can navigate complicated social dynamics in ways that don't resort to, I've got to win because someone else has to lose. It creates actually, I think, cooperative engagement. One of the things, though, that we might have as an objection, and Bryan and I have talked about this broader with metal, but not with pits in particular, which is, let's say that you've got somebody who would argue in sort of, let's say, early feminist sort of debates that would say celebrating a kind of aggression is itself to hyper masculinize discursive practices in ways that actually are not just potentially dangerous, but are necessarily exclusive in ways that actually just replicate injustices that our society has already allowed, right? And we did a whole episode just about women in metal and talked about all these unbelievably badass women that were just, crushing it on the mic and other things. So I actually am critical of the idea that this is a masculinity versus femininity thing. I actually think that women are just as aggressive in the pit. But what do you say to the objection that practices that would celebrate the stuff that can so quickly become associated with a kind of gender performance that might be socially destructive, right? I mean, we are three white dudes talking about, you know, getting in the pit and being aggressive and throwing our bodies against each other. I mean, I'm aware that this could be something that one might say, hey, in a time of assault, in a time of abuse, in a time of, you know, Me Too realities, shouldn't we just be saying, no, this is not okay, rather than saying, hey, it's risky, but there's these benefits to it? Like, what do you say to that kind of objection?
Yeah, I think that it's an additional reason to be conflicted about this stuff, because I think it varies from show to show. I mean, I certainly think there are some shows that are like pretty root and branch misogynist, right? And the stuff going on in the pit, like, I don't know what those people are doing when they leave the pit, but I'm staying away from them for sure.
And I should say, Ben McCraw, the co-editor of this book that we're doing, his essay in the book is about misogyny and feminism in death metal. Yeah. And so for people watching, once the book is out, I highly recommend you read Ben's essay, because it actually unpacks precisely what it looks like for both dangerous misogyny and pro-feminist voices, even in the most aggressive of the subgenres. So I think you're right. The depends certainly matters.
Yeah. And, you know, it's kind of a waffling to say it depends, because there's a certain aspect, like, you know, I write about this in the paper, that there is no question that metal celebrates violence. Like, you know, the most extreme, I mean, any crazy torturous thing you can cook up, it's like probably a lyric of one of your favorite metal songs, right? Disembowelment, like whatever thing. It's like, yep, that is the genre, right? And the more violent, the more attractive, and it's sort of a more holier than thou in terms of how brutal can we become, right? Lyric. Okay. So there's that sort of right, first order celebration of violence, right? But anyone who's actually like self-aware about the genre, it's largely ironic, right? Because most of the metal people, you know, are like, yeah, this is ironic, which is of course dangerous, because you know, I use the analogy of, you know, the you know, the Elon Musk Sieg Heil at the inauguration. It's like, okay, after the fact you can say it's ironic, but like, right? Like, first of all, you know, who is it ironic for? To what end is that irony being purposed? And wait, is it actually ironic, or are you just sort of floating it to see how it, right, how it trends?
Well, and also irony, right, would require a community of meaning that gets the hermeneutic act, right? And so you talk a little bit about this, about like, you know, people not familiar with the deep cultural norms of pit culture show up at a pit, and they're often the most dangerous, right?
Correct.
Because they, in many ways, don't understand what's happening. They don't understand that there are these norms. They don't understand that it's a actually help each other in the midst of this chaos. And so, yeah, you see somebody throw the Sieg Heil, you know, in the position of Musk. All kinds of, you might say, you know, the white nationalist adjacent groups see this as affirming or coding to them, hey, I got your back, which who's to say that wasn't what it was? And then we've got to make these interpretive choices about, no, does Elon even get the authority to decide what his behavior meant?
Right.
So,
you know, so when
it's crazy.
So, you know, I mean, all these bands saying these, you know, and to say glorifying violence, it's like, I mean, I don't think that's pretty controversial, that it is a kind of aestheticization of violence, like full on, for, you know, all sorts of reasons. Part of the appeal, right, of that razor's edge of moth to the flame, like craziness, is the cultic value, right? So metal has this cultic aura, right? And when I say cultic aura, I mean hitting all the notes of, you know, religion, religious traditions, devilry, right? All, you know, every trope in that world kind of creates this sort of cultic ecosystem, right? And sometimes it feels almost Ren Fairish in terms of like ye old religious practice in metal, and it's laughable at times, more Spinal Tap than actual cult. And for those who are like used to it, it's like it's like you watch some bands and they come out in cloaks and they're talking about the devil and like this is funny and entertaining and we get the joke. It's kind of a joke, but it's also like it's on the edge. And then someone shows up and it's like, wait, that dude's taking this seriously.
Yeah.
Right. And it's like, wait, no. Like, we're not really worshiping here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And now what's the really doing? Because when someone like me describes these experiences as like profound in ways, it's like, wait, what do we mean by worship? What do we mean by really worshiping? And then someone takes it literally, right? And the lines are they get quite complicated, right? So if someone sees this, say, as a an occultic affirmation of gendered violence, right? Which that's you could certainly read that. And if someone said, I thought this was a celebration of gendered violence, and I'm like, where did you get that? And it's like, it's right there. Like we're talking about like that. Like that's what the text
pretty
says.
Clear. Yeah.
Right. And it's like, oh no. Like that's not really it. Right. So as you say, like
you talk in your essay about the importance of these ethical standards and the role of elders, right? Pit elders or seen elders, right? Who have some, let's say, maybe epistemic weight, right? To sort of push, right? And to police those boundaries where if somebody's coming in and going, okay, this means we're going to go beat up women, right? There's like people going, no, you got it wrong. And so you can bring people in and correct them, right? Or in extreme cases, expel. So the role of the community in shaping that worship space is fundamental. And when these spaces become disordered is when there's anarchy in the scene, when you don't have that kind of sort of patterning.
Right. So there's a certain invitation for all of these nasty aspects within metal, right? It's like there's an invitation to violence. There's a bringing together of people who might be dodgy, right? Like you can have certainly misogynists, you can have fascists, you can they can come to shows, right? Like if you go to a Slayer or a Pantera show, like you're going to get all that, right? And okay, how do we steer, right? So you've brought together these people. How do we steer that in ways that we want it to be steered? Okay, who's the we, right? So first of all, you've got, the band, right? In many ways, the band has a unique authority, right? They literally have the mic. They have lyrical control. They write the texts, right? They are the, sort of the cult leaders. Some bands, right? So we'll call them, right, the more established, financially successful bands have the ability to, steer things in the direction they want it to go, and can do that to the extent that they might even sound kind of like soft, unmetal, right? Like, you can sort of hear the metal people saying like, get your whatever woke values off of my metal. For the established band, they're able to just be like, no, like we're not transphobic, we're not misogynist, we're anti-fascist. Like, you don't want that, get out, right? More junior bands are, potentially more afraid to do that kind of thing, in part because they know the more extreme they can be, the more attractive they might be, right? So, and this is where I write, we get into some problem with, something like the Travis Scott situation where, rage culture for the sake of rage culture, where, you're really, the primary goal is stirring the pot to, and you're a young artist, right? Trying to stir the pot to bring out as much rageness as possible, and that, that can be on many different vectors of, politics, but just, it's difficult, right? So then there's a role for the artist, there's a role for the venue, there's a role for the more the elder people who are kind of you can only do so much, right? Like when a pack of bros shows up at a show and they want to fight, like there are certain things you can do, right? You can alert security, hope security is competent. You can try to like provide a buffer. You can try to do basic de-escalation things and just try to get through the show without bad stuff happening. That we're kind of like one layer in the whole structure. And then when things go wrong, like there are rules, regulations, laws, attorneys. There is lots of litigation around this stuff. Attorneys know that they can make a lot of money from injuries that happen in pits. It's a real thing. Some attorneys specialize in this stuff, which in some way it's like, wow, yeah, it's kind of mind blowing that exists. But it's just like whatever, attorneys who work on ski injuries.
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things in your essay for me was when you talk about like this manual that these attorneys have produced. It's like, here's the way to do things. Here's how to protect yourself. But if it goes bad, call us, and it was so bizarre that exists. But
right, you're right, because it's like this clash of, there's this sort of super individualist, authoritarian, anti-rule alternative culture that like exists to kind of be outside the ordinary world, right? Again, like cultic, and it's sort of, and then there's like right over there the attorneys watching, right? Almost in the balcony, like handing out cards, like if you slam your head into the pavement, like call me.
It's crazy.
It's like that, part of the the appeal of metal is this illusion of what's going on, right? The illusion of freedom in the pit, the illusion of individuality, the illusion of authenticity, and like it, being able to maintain that for the sake of fun. Like you're in a bit of theater, you're in a bit of sort of collective performance, but it's a semblance, right? Like these are not actually radical activities, and if you think they are radical activities, it's like, okay, maybe like you need to, like you're not mature in the process, right? And you need a bit of kind of coaching up to know, like, all right, this is how the collective work of art is usually done, which is of course very hard to say because the nature of the thing is kind of anti-rule, anti-authoritarian, right? The semblance of not having rules. Of course, there are very clear rules, and we know them, but we maintain the semblance of utter chaos, right? It's not chaos. It's constrained. It's right. Like, here, go do your thing here for 35 minutes. We'll take a break at minute 17, right? And then the lights are going to come on and here's the merchandise. Right. This is a very controlled environment. And, I think it's in part the responsibility of the bands and the venues to, know what they're getting into and to do the kind of choreographing so that you can have a fun show that's also reasonably safe. Right. If you take all the danger out of it, like it's going to kill the thing. Right.
Well, it's weird.
Like you can't take all the danger out of skiing, right? It's like you can't do it.
Well, it reminds me of Plato in the Republic. Has this kind of quick little move that happens. I think it's like in book 1, where they try out this account of the perfect society, and it's immediately rejected. It's like, nope, nobody will actually believe that this is possible. We'll all be bored. Everybody will revolt. And so what they then offer is what Socrates refers to as a fevered city. He's like, well, then I guess the thing we should consider an ideal is this less, perfect thing. And we see the same thing, like even in the film The Matrix, where they tried, the robot overlords, tried a perfect, wonderful place with no risk, and everybody revolted. And so it does seem to me that there's something inherent in the human condition. And as an existentialist, I think this is what the existential tradition gets right, that all decisions are accompanied by some degree of epistemic uncertainty. All actions are associated with a reality and an awareness of our embodied vulnerability, right? Like there's nothing we can do, say, believe, enact that we might not just get really wrong and have really bad outcomes. Now we do, like you say, we do the best we can to create epistemic structures of reliable belief forming mechanisms. We do our best to cultivate virtues of character that are unlikely to lead us to the bad outcomes that could otherwise follow. But all that sort of behavior is something that's still deeply nested within a kind of indeterminacy or undecidability about how to proceed, right? And I think one of the things that is maybe so attractive to me about extreme music is in a society that is deeply, deeply enamored with, we might say, the tools of management. You're like, here's how we manage chaos. Here's how we put everything in their place. Here's how we go to school and line people up so that they can be okay sitting for 8 hours in corporate jobs. Oh, what gives you dignity is the fact that you're doing something practical, and this is setting you up for, like, all of it is just the human condition as a management strategy. And then you go to a metal show and it's like, no, this song might actually go off the rails. You know, this guitar tone isn't what you expected. What if we play at the limits of harmony? What if we just decide, screw it, we're not even going to hit notes, and you've got pig squeals and growls and all kinds of stuff starting to show up. So for me, part of that is this like real deep existential awareness that management cannot tame the risk inherent in existing, right? And metal captures some of that for me.
Yeah, certainly a little bit. And people who are attracted to metal, right? I don't want to overgeneralize, but it's a lot of disaffected folks who are kind of tearing with metal to kind of, you know, flirt with the void a little bit, right? Both the, you know, the music for one is kind of, you know, looking into the darker aspects of one's finitude and one's existential condition. And then, you know, entering a show and a pit is sort of a next level embodied, like, you know, here is a flirtation with the void. You know, and it's very controlled and, you know, kind of juvenile in ways, but it scratches an itch. And, you know, people scratching that itch together, like with all of our finitude, making this collective work of art that's, you know, a little dodgy, but in the end, like, there's camaraderie, there's good faith, you know, there's like compassion, you know, like that's a sort of, you know, being togetherness, right? A being with in the face of finitude, death, danger, right? And that's why sort of, you know, the ethical components are, I think, not silly, right? Where you have disaffected people who, you know, whatever mental space they're in, show up at these shows, and, you know, sometimes you can tell like people are struggling, and this is definitely the best part of their month, going to the show. Like, this is the most life affirming thing. They've got their job, their education, whatever's going on, like, this is like their happy place, and their happy place is, you know, tearing with the negative, like looking at, you know, being with other people in the abyss for a little bit and like feeling embodied, feeling alive, feeling like there's a camaraderie in the awfulness of the world, right? Like, a lot of metal is about the awfulness of the world, right? Brutality, the meat grinderness of existence, and still life affirming, right? Like, coming out the other side, like, when most of you probably, you know, put the metal in your ears, it's like life turns up a few degrees. It's like, all right, I was kind of like in the malaise, but then I lock into whatever, and it's like, all right, like, there's a little more hop in my step. I'm a little more energized. I'm a little more alive. I think for probably everyone, it's like, yeah, whatever your baseline is, like, metal can, you know, for the right kind of person, it amplifies life a little bit.
One of the questions I ask students sometimes is, if you're angry, what kind of music do you like to listen to? And it splits, right? There's some kids who are like, I need something calm. And then there are other weirdos like me who say, no, I need something hard. I need something more angry than I am.
Yes,
And
therapeutic.
then it's cathartic. And I just think, those are the folks who are there because, you grew up like me in this little town and you just don't feel a part of anything. And you are starting to realize the role of these sort of hegemonic traditions that are controlling. And then here's this music, and the lyrics are like, actually, no, this hegemony can be challenged. We can name it, we can throw it off. There is freedom outside of control, and it feels like a release. And it's a way of channeling and processing that anger. But then when you do it with other people in a room, now it's communal. Now I'm not a weirdo, by myself. This is something we're processing together. And my experience has been that creates a very kind, affirming, welcoming community. I've always been struck by how nice everyone is at metal shows, and I take my sons, and they're welcomed, and they're inviting them over and giving them, it's like it's a positive community, and I think it's such a gift. Really, it's a gift.
Something I find
it's
super
weird.
interesting is, so I'm in New Hampshire, and a lot of our shows are pretty intense, and a lot of the regulars are the scariest looking people you'll ever see, right, with full head tattoos and like all sorts of spiky stuff. And if you were to come across them in the grocery store, it would be like, yikes. But kindness flows from these people, at least in these environments where I interact with them. It's like just like people who've been through some stuff, and like this is their place, and they see other people who are going through stuff, and it's like, we can deal with stuff. Like this is like our weird little community, and we're here to help each other out.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I was talking to Rob Talise this week for an interview for a different podcast I was doing with him. And he said one of the things that frustrates him often about his students, and he and I were sort of expressing solidarity about this, and Bryan, it picks up on what you just said. He's like, he was talking to a student recently who was basically saying, hey, I got an A- in your class. Could it please be an A? I'll never get into Yale without a A- or without an A.
Vanderbilt.
Yeah, as Vandy students, I tell you, as a Vandy grad, it's very familiar. And so he's, talking to the student, and he looks at the student and he says, well, look, let's assume that you're right. Let's assume that 1 A- in Intro to Political Theory is wrecking your future law career. Let's assume. He said, but why is it you've chosen the right response to be, how can I conform to the machine that is so effing stupidly formed that an A- in political theory has now ended my, Yale law career, right? He says, why don't you, and I thought this was so cool, he says, why don't you simply say, well, F Yale, screw that, I'll go to Fordham, right? I will not be part of a space that is so conformity driven, that is so boring. And Talise looked at him and said, why don't you just go buy some Dead Kennedys albums and get your head out your butt, right? Like the reality of something about this, punk and metal culture that says, stop thinking the right response is always, how can I look like those who have decided what things should look like? Maybe they're wrong about the way things look. Maybe we could do something different. And that, I think, is something that I find so compelling about metal as a performative example of what ethical community could be, right? I mean, think about it. Yes, there is racism, kind of surface level textual realities in some of metal. Yes, there is misogyny surface level. Yes, there is anti-LGBTQ realities. Like all of this stuff that we would oppose and fight against, and many, I would say, within the metal community fight against. However, it's also the case that at the vast majority of the shows I attend, and I admit I'm not going to Golgoroth and Deathspell Omega and stuff, right? So I think also being a educated listener, you can say, that show is likely to have way too many swastikas. I'm just not even going to be part of it, right? But the kind of shows I tend to go to, which are pretty extreme things, the pits are this bizarre space where, you know, your background doesn't matter, your race doesn't matter, your identity, your value, your politics, unless again it's, you know, awful exclusive politics. It's a space where we all come together, and the instructions are things like turn right, go fast, pick somebody up if they fall. Like that's all you need. Let's be together, right? And there's something about that that I find the right kind of rebellion in an age of radical conformity and disinformation, right? It's a space where we figure this stuff out and we do it together.
So yeah, just to, you know, to be conflicted about this, the title of my paper is conflicted, and this is something I'm conflicted about because, you know, exactly on the one hand, it's like metal is the space of individualism, freedom loving, alternativeness, getting all your yayas out as an individual, and, you know, being anti-authoritarian and all that. And each of you should individually go and you know, be alternative. Yes, right. Space of freedom.
Right.
On the other hand, there are structural dimensions and collective action dimensions that, like, you know, I worry sometimes that this is just like, you know, all this metal energy is like, you know, play politics, right? Like, you know, people who have, you know, interests in whatever cause, they, you know, use it. You know, this is, you know, and this is an Adorno kind of thing. Like, this is the semblance of critique, where, you know, we enter these spaces and we're all crazy, and then we buy our merch and go home, and like we're still bombing XYZ, and you know, and so instead of like actually doing politics, like in legislative ways, we, you know, we're individually having our, you know, our political energy siphoned off in a pit or in our headphones, rather than collectively acting to, you know, enact structural changes to whatever, you know, thing. So it's like, that's another thing I'm conflicted about, because it, in a way that, like, metal glorifies individual freedom. And individual freedom is important, right? But individual freedom is also a kind of ideology that, you know, doesn't always do the job of collective change, right? So if, you know, whatever, the kid who gets an A- and goes listen to Dead Kennedys, you know, that's great. But whatever, you know, is that what the student is doing instead of, like, you know, doing actual political action, right? Are they fixing themselves to whatever, enhance their legal career, to maximize their personal income, rather than thinking about, like, oh, that's, you know, collectively, you know, messed up. So, you know, it's something I'm conflicted about, is this, you know, all art as play in some way, and right, and this is another example of that.
Well, it could be
if
the
that
case,
same
right?
critique applies to
Go ahead, Bryan.
academia, if you think about the same critique applies to academia, right? We have these seminar classrooms where we bemoan the military state or whatever, and then we go have chicken fingers and go about our day. I mean, it's the same. It's just the problem we live. I don't know that it's an answer to Adorno's critique, really.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the things that I see as maybe a potential, you know, kind of as we close out this afternoon, like one of the things that I find potentially exciting about metal as a kind of maybe guide for future politics is there is another critique that one could offer, which is, well, of course, it's easy for people to say this kind of stuff and buy their merch and go home, and because it's still so predominantly, you know, a privileged class of largely white men showing up to whine about how frustrating their lives are, what they've had to deal with, and so they buy black, you know, t-shirts and they go home. As Randy Bly said to me once, he said, "I'm not actually a metal musician. I'm a black cotton salesman who just plays some music to try to hustle t-shirts." But like, and I think that there's a reasonable objection that, lots of white men getting together to find solidarity, even if that's good for mental health and whatever, like they're like, well, the structural change doesn't actually have to happen because in some ways they're already benefiting from the structure, right? However, in a time where Trump's been reelected, in a time of increasing just insanity, unreasonable citizenry, everybody hates everybody kind of spaces, I actually really believe that the hope has to be right-wing populists and left-wing populists get together and find some sort of awareness that, you know, collective action in response to oligarchs, say, is really something we can all agree about, right? And so one of the things that I find so profound in metal music is the class consciousness that pervades it, right? So even though I would say I actually celebrate some of the cross-racial, cross-gendered, cross-identitied spaces that pits provide, it is also the case that despite the fact that we are all three professors going to metal shows, the primary group showing up in pits is not going to be your socially advantaged economic class typically. And so you end up getting this kind of working class sensibility. And the idea that you could have a working class sensibility that is now fighting Nazi punks like the Dead Kennedys would encourage seems to be something that is itself correctly interruptive of a broader society that is telling us there's a working class struggle that is a right-wing set of political commitments. And I think metal can show us a way for left populism to grab a kind of broader traction.
Yeah, I'm not sure in terms of content, metal is that homogenous in terms of, I think a lot of metal, the class consciousness is implicit at best and sometimes completely absent. I mean, I think it's a handful of metal bands where you sort of make the case that that's explicit. I mean, this is, I think, related to the cultic nature of what what content. Any metal fan should like whatever look at their favorite album and look at the lyrics and ask themselves, why do I like this? Because,
Yeah.
like if my kid scratched these words on like a piece of paper, I'd be worried. Why do I like this? And it's hard to say it's because of the whatever progressive nature. I think a lot of it, it's like, man, this is this glorifies violence. Why am I into this? Okay, for ironic reasons. Okay, and for myself, I certainly think I ask myself, this is something I was into as a teenage dude, and I'm still listening to it, and it's like, man, should you outgrow this stuff? Like, are you too old? Like, not just that you're too old to be in a pit, but like, should you be embarrassed about listening to stuff? Because I know, like, if some of my colleagues, like, they read this paper, they're like, oh my God, ick, right? That's, how do you associate with those circles? And I'm sure, you guys get the same sort of thing. And, I'm willing to keep hanging out in this space, and I'm conflicted about it. In part because I think a lot of metal, the content in the political messaging is not necessarily good and easily co-optable toward the bad. And, certainly, one of the main tenets of fascism is the glorification of violence,
right?
And misogyny and, authoritarianism. And, there is a strain in metal that's anti-authoritarian, but when we get into the cultic spaces, cults are authoritarian often. And it's, it could go either way. Yeah. Which is why, I say in the paper that, extreme music, it attracts extreme views.
Yeah.
And, that makes sense, and it's dodgy, right? Because it makes total sense why extremes on both sides are attracted to this stuff. Yeah. And it's like, on the class issue, we haven't talked that much about it, but the Travis Scott situation, really, I find that fascinating, the way, for many older metal folk, it's like, oh, like the crossovers happening into, sort of transracial rage culture and moshing. It's like, oh, that's almost a misnomer, but you realize that that's, sort of pound for pound now where most of the action is in moshing.
Right.
And it's highly commodified, right? And Travis Scott was the master of that in taking this notion of rage, and it's very marketable because there are so many disaffected people who like are pissed off and want to go rage and want to like go like, jump off scaffolding at a show and like maybe die. And to have an artist encouraging that. And to have promotional videos encouraging like, all the stuff like jumping, jumping boundaries, fighting, to actually throw gas on the worst aspects for profit. And it's like the more extreme you can make it seem and the more dangerous you can make it seem, the more marketable it is. And the more marketable it is to the most disaffected crowd, who then goes and dies.
And Astro World tickets are not exactly cheap, right? I mean, like the even the amount of money it takes to participate in those spaces is a thing that, Pearl Jam and others have fought for a long time, but yet it's still really expensive. So, well, I think this has been fantastic. Bryan, do you have any final thoughts? I'm going to end with an impromptu 3 questions that we will ask all our guests, which I just came up with now. So this was not planned ahead of time, as most metal things are. You decided the spot. So, Nick, 3 questions that we will from henceforth ask all of our guests to close out our shows with them. What is the best metal show you've ever attended?
It's like choosing a favorite child.
I'm aware of the Sophie's Choice.
I'm a longtime Melvins fan. And Melvins, Middle East, Boston, late mid-90s.
Wow.
That, I can't even separate. I mean, so many different kinds of shows, like from, some of the Japanese noise stuff is just a unique and uniquely amazing aesthetic experience to, late early 90s Slayer shows. But of course the show of shows in terms of irony and the razor's edge of craziness is always going to be Guar. Just really surfing that, all of it, the craziness, the politics, the way Guar would, ironically go on Fox News and just the performative, the aesthetic, just really, I think a unique thing.
I agree.
All right.
I've never seen the Melvins. Would love to. I'm a fan of, Buzz and his work. The Guar show I saw was, one of the strangest and most spectacle of all spectacles I have ever encountered. So I can definitely agree with that one.
You really know you're in an art performance when you go to a Guar show.
And it's also the only metal show where people intentionally wear white T-shirts, right? So definitionally, the aesthetics is different. 2, so if you had one album that you return to most often, so it's not the only one you ever listen to, not the one that you're on, a desert island, but you find yourself keep coming back to, what is that album?
When I'm grading papers, which is quite often, Electric Wizard, Dope Throne.
Nice. Very cool. Deep. Yes, that's Bryan, right in your wheelhouse there, man.
Oh yeah.
And then finally, you could go have drinks with any metal artist of all time. Like who is it you take out? Alive, dead? Who's the person you want to go have drinks with?
My close friend Rick Orcutt, who is the drummer for Scissor Fight, one of New Hampshire's sort of most classic mountain metal, and he lives down the road from me. So I don't need anyone famous. All these people are.
That's fantastic. Well, Nick, it has been an absolute thrill to have you with us here on God Hates Us All Radio, and everybody listening, watching. We will certainly let you know as soon as the book is out, so you can go read Nick's essay and all the amazing essays from colleagues across the field. And Bryan, any final thoughts before we close out today?
No, this was great. I'm 52, about to turn 53, and I think I can say I haven't been in a pit, and I don't think I'm going to get in one. I think my window of Mosh pits is closed.
You can just like walk through one sometimes and like
maybe so.
Well, so for what it's worth, Bryan, this fall I am planning to go see. It's not one of my favorite bands or anything, but it's a band that I like occasionally. Signs of the Swarm is coming through town. And so if you want to go get in a pit, I will take you to Signs of the Swarm, and we can see you become a pit elder with no experience in pits. I think that's entirely fine. So we'll make that happen.
Well, maybe we should just do a live stream from the show, then just make content out of it.
Hell yeah. Sounds great. And Nick can be out having drinks with his friend and watching us and jealous that he's not down there in the midst of the melee. So, well, Nick, thank you so much, my friend. I appreciate your work. Appreciate what you're doing. And hopefully our sons will at some point be able to throw horns up in the pit together. So
thank you guys for doing this. Thank you for great questions.